right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Inside Writing. This show is presented by Gotham Writers Workshop, offering writing classes of all types and sizes. You can visit us at gothamwriters.com. Also, this is our last episode of the season, which is awesome. It went by so fast. More about that at the end of the show. But for now, a quick announcement that if you've missed any episode of Inside Writing, you can get caught up on our YouTube channel or wherever you listen to podcasts. The same will go for the show today. It'll be available by tomorrow morning. And speaking of which, if you do enjoy the show, consider giving it a review on wherever you listen to your podcast or subscribing and liking on YouTube. The more reviews and followers we have, the more people it'll reach. So you're doing everyone a favor. Moving into the show for today, a reminder that you can enter your questions for the Q&A portion at any point. There's that Q&A button on your Zoom dashboard. If you have any questions for our panelists, you can ask them there. The sooner you get your questions in, the better. So get those questions in as soon as you have them. And on to the subject for today. We're going to be talking about comics and cartoons. And our quote for today comes from Tom Spielman, who said, "All art makes a statement, and comics have from the very beginning. From the earliest political cartoons to Golden Age Superman being a walking, talking New Deal reformer, comics have always been and will always be political." More on that later. For now, let's meet our panelists. First off, author and illustrator of the graphic memoir Dear Scarlet, the story of my postpartum depression, as well as pieces appearing in The Believer, Ecotone, and more, Teresa Wong. Hello, Teresa. Teresa, are you there?
Sorry, I lost my mouse for a second.
It's all right. Thanks for being here, Teresa.
Thanks for the introduction.
Absolutely.
I'm happy to be here.
And our second panelist, the comics editor at the Rumpus, as well as a cartoonist with work appearing in the Rumpus, National Lampoon, Splitsider, and more, Brandon Hicks. Hello, Brandon.
Hello.
Hi there. Thank you for being here, Brandon.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So first question, we're going to start with our definitions. And Teresa, I want to start with you. What, in the simplest terms, what is a comic? How would you define a comic?
Yeah, that's a tough question. I think the way I would define it normally is kind of marrying images and text to tell a story. Sometimes over numerous panels, sometimes kind of in a free form flow or in one panel. But then there are also wordless comics. So I guess maybe not the text is so important, but I guess just storytelling through imagery is the way I see it.
Brendan, how does that differ from a cartoon, or is there a difference?
Well, a cartoon is generally more specifically a panel-based, but comics, cartoons are kind of in the same sphere. When I think of it, I think it's kind of like the third form of storytelling. There's poetry, there's prose, and then there's comics, which is kind of the most fluid and therefore the most interesting to me. It kind of marriages both. It can kind of divert to its own, but I always see it in those three spheres.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's like really tough to define because comics is so young in a way. It's one of the younger forms of at least published work or literary work. And so it's almost whatever you can make of it. And there are new versions and ways of doing comics coming out all the time.
Absolutely, especially right now, like with the online comics, it's completely shifted it. I think for the better, and it's getting consistently more interesting.
Mm-hmm. So I want to get into the creation process a bit. Teresa, starting with you, when you get ideas that you want to put down on the page to turn into a story, which comes first? Does the story, do you think of the words first, the illustrations first, or does it come together? What's your process like when you create something?
Well, it's morphed over the years. So you mentioned my book. When I started that, I was pretty much strictly a writer, and I didn't think I could actually do a comic. I thought I would write something, storyboard it out, and find an illustrator to help me kind of bring it to life. And so that's what I did. I wrote a whole script out, and then I worked on the images, and then no one actually well, the friend I asked to help me said, no, you've got to draw it because it's your personal story. And so that's what I did. But nowadays, what I've been trying to do more is kind of write and draw at the same time, and kind of do little thumbnails, or, tiny little drawings while I'm kind of writing out an idea, just to kind of bring those two things together more closely, because sometimes the drawing informs the writing, or the writing informs the drawing, and I don't want one to take precedence over the other anymore.
Brendan, what about you? What's your process like?
Well, it kind of varies, but Teresa's right that it's important that they kind of play off each other, the words and the images. So typically when I have an idea, it's kind of a weird form of something that kind of actually happens, almost like a memory. So I'll either do a quick thumbnail sketch and a point list of all the things that's going to happen in the comic or in the panel. And I'll just sketch it out. So usually a page, like I'm making notes for this talk, and it just doodles all over, because that's kind of how my brain works. It's interchangeable. So I'll do that, and then I'll typically do more concrete thumbnails, and then maybe type out the text to make sure it's I have good focus on that. But it's always together, and then finally just kind of put it together.
Gotcha. So if I asked you which side of it was harder, the illustrations or the words, do you have an opinion on which one do you find more difficult, or does it just vary?
Words, for sure.
Words, gotcha.
Because I primarily went into this as a writer. Like I never took any drawing classes. It was never really my focus. I obviously love drawing, and I do it every day. But I always wanted to be a writer. So that's the thing that I'm most nervous about. And that's kind of what I always held to the highest standard. But the pictures, people care, but clarity is the most important thing. So as long as you do a quick thumbnail that's clear, you can add detail and stuff, but keep that simple image. The wording gets a lot more complicated for me. It's because then on top of that, not only do you have to draw, you have to write it well and clear. And so I end up doing a quick sketch, get the image down quickly, and then can go back later and fix that. But the wording, I just,
That's interesting, because I'm almost the exact opposite. The words come a little bit more easily. I mean, they're still hard, but the drawing, like, I'm not confident in my drawing at all. I was not trained in any way, and really only started drawing about like 5 years ago. And so I always have these images in my mind that, are really beautiful and glorious, and there's no way to get them out onto paper the way I want them to. And I
believe that comes down, if I might compliment you, like reading your book, you had an excellent sense of clarity, which, especially as an editor, it's the first thing I always look for, is just like, can I read this? I look to, there's a page in your book that I thought was great, where you were kind of describing the stages of your pregnancy, and you showed like physically the changes in silhouette.
Right, yeah.
And then below it, you had kind of what was happening. It was just very clear, very graphic, graphically presented. And while there's not like a ton of detail, it was clear. I could understand exactly what was happening. And it's not a medium that would be just text. Like, it had to be comics, but like you understood it.
Thanks. Yeah, no, that means a lot coming from you, Brandon. I love all of your artwork. And so yeah, but so it's been a struggle for me over the past few years, just trying to get into comics, even just to kind of find a style and figure out kind of how to do the art in a way that is not embarrassing to myself.
Yeah, I'm still trying to figure that out myself.
So you both have brought this up, and I was going to touch on this later, but neither one of you has any formal artistic training. So what do you do to practice your art? Teresa, we'll start with you. Is it just sort of trial and error? You just draw and see what happens?
Yeah, I mean, it's sitting down and doing it is the biggest thing. And I, like, when I first started doing the book, I also started an Instagram and decided to do a daily drawing for a year, just to kind of get going and and practice and figure out my style. And and through that you could see improvement. Like, I'm not where I want to be, but I'm better than I was. And so it's just kind of trying and practicing and kind of finding what feels comfortable.
Mm-hmm. Same with you, Brandon. Is it just sort of you've been practicing for so long that you've sort of just developed your own way of doing it?
Yeah, absolutely. I would like to piggyback of what Teresa said about Instagram. Like, I think it's really important these days to, it's one way to get yourself out there, but also it's just something you need to get comfortable with to kind of fail in public. Because I know early on when I was trying to do comics, I knew what I wanted to look like and can never get there. And there's always a level of embarrassment to that. But if you're kind of paralyzed by the embarrassment, you'll never do anything. So it's okay to be embarrasst for a few years if the end result, you get better and better. And the truth is, nobody really cares. They'll just scroll past it. They might think like, oh, that sucks, but very few people comment that sucks. So
yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So you can just you put it out and maybe it's not very good, but then tomorrow you draw something else, and then the next day you do something else. So just do it as often as possible and do it in public. Like, try and have an audience, and you'll get less and less embarrassed over time, and your work will get better.
I think that's a great point too. Is I saw the artist or cartoonist Tilly Walden talk once, and she said the difference between like a professional cartoonist or the thing that unites all professional cartoonists is that they actually finish their work and put it out there, because a lot of people kind of hide away their work in sketchbooks and kind of are too scared to show anyone. And the thing that we all have in common who are doing it a little bit more professionally is that we put it somewhere for people to see. And that's a huge part of just finishing your work, is you finish it, but you also show it.
Absolutely. I mean, I agree. One of the biggest things I see is people, they say, oh, I'd love to try it, or I've been sketching and drawing, but every time I have a project in mind that I let stew for a long, long time, by the time I get to it, it never actually meets what you want. So finish quickly. Once I have so you'll have something, and then maybe it's not as good as you thought, but then you can work on something else and then finish that. Again, it might not be what you thought, but it'll exist.
Mm-hmm.
And that's true. That's the number one thing everyone has to do, both in writing and in comics, I find, is just actually get a project done and out there. Mm-hmm. And social media is great for that. I think it's important that people try and get comfortable. Mm-hmm. That's kind of the world we're living in right now for media. So. Right.
So one thing we often talk about on this show is writers finding their specific voice, their brand as a writer. And I feel like as artists, it's even more so. Like, I think with both of you, if you look at your art, you can identify it as, oh, this is Teresa's, this is Brandon's. There's a specific brand to it, a specific look. Brandon, how long did it take for you to start being able to identify your own brand? And do you feel like you have one?
This year, I've finally got comfortable with the idea that I don't. I've always focused, when you go into any medium, but obviously we're talking about comics specifically, you have giants that you're trying to aspire to, and you're going to rip them off, especially early on. You're going to try and be the next whomever, but it's probably not going to happen. You're going to be best case scenario, best version of you. So a lot of people tend to obsess about style, and I see this all the time where people will try and do something quirky that really emphasizes their style, but if that becomes the focus, they're kind of limiting themselves in what they can achieve. So I think the first thing is, especially with comics, is try not to worry too much about your style. Learn some drawing fundamentals, tell your story, be clear, and it just kind of comes. Or at least that's been my experience. Especially recently, I've just found that the more I work, the less I'm trying to, this is a Brandon Hicks drawing, but instead it's a drawing by Brandon Hicks. Mm-hmm. And then eventually you're going to, whether you want to or not, have quirks and stuff that are unique to you. So that's what your style will develop.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I totally agree. I think, I don't remember where I read this, but the style is kind of what you can't help but do, you know, with your own hand, and there's something in your hand as an artist where that just comes out, and that's your style. And so I think for me, a lot of it is comes out of my limitations, which isn't, I'm trying to reconcile that and kind of think of it as not as a bad thing anymore. But, you know, a lot of what I do is very spare. And it's because I actually can't draw all of the things that I want to draw. And so, but working within that spareness is also a style.
Absolutely. And I think one of the things you do very well, and the most important thing that I notice is just keeping things clear. When people are, and I repeat myself a lot here, but one, you write clearly. That's very important. Like I see a lot of busy comics, a lot of people who try to do unique things with wording, their lettering, but work being sparse to begin with is probably your best mode. Because I know the reason I think this is such a big deal for me is because it's something I struggled with early on. I wanted to be great right off the bat. So I would just fill panels with like ludicrous details and put lettering everywhere. And it was almost impossible to read. And I assumed everyone would read it because I'm a genius, right? So, but that's not the case. So I think you had a great point there when you say, like, you know, you're working with your limitations, but you're keeping things clear. You're aware of what the limitations are, and you're aware of the audience and what they're able to read.
And just to get kind of a sense of time, Brandon, when you start working on a particular story that you want to tell, how long are you usually working on it for? Like, what's your general time frame?
Well, with the Rumpus, I do something every 2 weeks, and it kind of varies depending on what the thing is. Sometimes I get overly ambitious, and so I'll stack a few up ahead of time that are a little shorter and go, but I try to keep it a 2 week time frame. If I'm working on something that's just going to go out online more than 2 weeks, then it's I think I'm limiting myself for other options. I recently finished a book, which is just a short picture book. It's like 35, 40 pages. And I spent 3 months on that. So that just drawing that, spent 5 months in total on the project. But generally speaking, I like to work quickly. I think try to work quickly and well and clear, but I like kind of having that volume and moving forward and trying new things and surprising myself. I find if I get too bogged down, then I repeat myself more and I get more nervous about ideas, and I tend to self-censor more, and it ends up not being as good.
I really admire that because, yeah, I was looking through Brandon's work online. It's like, whoa, he's so prolific. Like, there's just so much out there, and that's an incredible feat, actually, because it's so hard to get things done, especially in COVID times and whatever. And so the fact that you have a process in place that keeps you going, and you don't get in your own way kind of and stuck in your own head is
thank you. I really
admirable.
For me, I find a big part of the help of that is keeping things varied. I like to do a lot of different kind of work.
That's the other thing I noticed about your work is that there's like, the color and the black and white and, different styles and different types and tones too, some are sadder, more thoughtful comics, and some are just super funny. And
yeah, I guess that's more just a byproduct of my, like, if I do get stuck, which considering how much I try to do, I just can't let that happen. So I'll look for whatever will drive me in something else. So if I'm working on a story, it's just not working, I'll write a joke for somebody else. And I can just put a joke together. I'll look at the news, write a joke, and then I'll come back to the story. Or if something isn't looking quite right, maybe I can use a different brush on my iPad, like my Procreate app. And that will spur me forward. Like, oh, that looks nice. So maybe that's what this is. This looks kind of like this. More like if I'm trying to... Sorry, I'm get ahead of myself a little bit. But if I'm working on a story that's, I don't know what the direction is, and I'm working my usual style, I'll switch the brush and say, oh, this looks kind of like Curious George. Maybe it's more of a kid's book vibe. So
Right.
I'll let that drive the story. So I'm always trying to just keep it varied, to keep productivity up. That's a big part of.
That's great. Talking about timelines, I'm kind of the opposite. Yes. Well, the book took me about 9 months to write and draw, and kind of have the manuscript done. And then I'm trying to work on another book right now, but it's super slow going. I'm trying to break it down into little chunks so that I can actually get stuff done. But you know, I'll produce a comic a year if I'm lucky.
There's no one way to do it. And obviously,
no, I want to get faster though. I want to learn from you and other cartoonists I see out there who are just putting more out there. And that's one of my goals for, you know, this year is to kind of write shorter and faster.
Sure. Like what I admire about your work too, though, is there is a depth to it. Like you with your book, especially, you're touching topics that like I would have to touch with safety gloves. Like it's what you were bringing to that was a lot deeper than when I'm trying to sketch out a story. So there's no one way of doing things, but especially when you're working on a project of that scale and of that kind, I think it's important that you took your time, and I think there is a lot of value to that as well.
So I want to share a specific work from both of our panelists now. I'm going to start with Teresa's. This is a piece that she had in the Believer. And if anybody's listening to this and not watching, I'll include the link to this in the show notes. But this is not a feel-good movie. And Teresa, I have to admit, it was whenever I first came here, I saw this first panel and thought that this was the story because it reads almost like a complete story, just the way you use space. I didn't realize when you scroll down here, there's 8 pages to it, and it tells a much longer, in-depth story. But even just from this first paneling, I kind of just want to get your process of how you developed this story and how you decided on or how you match the illustrations to the story that you wanted to tell here. So how did this come about?
This was actually a comic I wrote and drew to get into the Tin House summer workshop in 2019. They had started a graphic narrative stream, and I wanted to be part of it. And so you needed to submit some work, and I had nothing except for my book. And so I decided to create a new comic, and this is drawn from life. Again, a true story of me and my mom, and the time that I tried to get her to watch the Joy Luck Club with me, because I thought it would bring us together. You'll find out in the comic what happens.
Right.
But really, it was the first page here is. A lot of comics do this, just try to set the scene, you know, without necessarily using words, giving a kind of mood and a tone to the piece. And so I knew I wanted it to be at nighttime, and I knew I wanted to establish kind of my mom and I as characters, and then also kind of the distance between us, and so this page specifically came out of doing that workshop, because I had actually started the story the next page before, and it was to show the distance using paneling and kind of division in the if you flip back to the last page. So previously I had started it here, but I just wanted to kind of divide my mom and me, and to kind of show that there was something between us that was kind of unspoken, and so I learned that through the workshop and wanted to apply it right away to my comic, and and that's how this started.
Mm-hmm.
I love that. That's really good. I haven't seen this piece.
Yeah, I mean, like I said, I thought that the first panel was it. I thought that was because to me, it tells a full story, like what you were saying with the way it divides everything and the way you use the dark space compared to the light space. I just think it's a very compelling.
Is this, I'm going to say I stole this idea anyways, because in our workshop leader was Kristen Radke, who is the comics editor and associate publisher, I think, at The Believer. And she showed us a few pages from Alison Bechdel's Fun Home, and we kind of analyzed them. And Fun Home has a lot of this where she's showing her dad and her in different situations around their house, and they're kind of being divided, or separated using objects or panels or windows and things. And so this is, I guess, an homage to Alison Bechdel as well.
So I want to come back to this in a second, but I want to get Brandon's work over here now. This was on the Rumpus, or it's on the Rumpus, called Like a Kid Again. And I'm going to scroll through it really slowly so people can keep up with what's happening here. And then Brandon, I'm going to ask you what the conceptualization process was here and how you got started with it. So you got a kid jumping into a leaf pile, or a guy jumping into a leaf pile, becoming a kid again. And then we realize that he actually wasn't a kid again, that it was just a rock in the leaf pile. So Brandon, what was your process like here with this one?
Yeah, so obviously this doesn't have the emotional depth of Teresa's. When I started on this particular one, it just, I mean, fall had just started, and I wanted to do something that kind of had that feeling. So I found, especially with during COVID, I've paid more attention to just the changing seasons and how I feel about, like, just look for the positive and everything, right? So when fall came around, it's like, fall is really nice. You can go on long walks on your own. There are aspects that you can enjoy. So I kind of want to get that feeling in a comic, but I also kind of want to be funny and a little sharp and surprising. So I did have the sense of, like, it reminds me of, how I was when I was a kid. So I tried to draw the first few, I just started drawing it in thumbnails, and I wanted to get something that kind of had some soft fall colors that kind of get that emotion down, but I still want people to laugh. So at the end, I kind of undercut it with kind of some dark humor, but the initial emotion of it is actually very similar to what that guy feels. It was something I was trying to communicate, how fall made me feel, but also try to be a little funny.
I like how you did a little bit of the unexpected, because when you talk about fall colors, it's always about the leaves, but in this comic it's like he's in color and the leaves are in black and white.
Yeah,
it's really cool
when I do something like that, because it is obviously more to do with the character than the environment, like, because fall is going to happen regardless, but how you feel about it is more personal. So that's kind of...
And you brought up something that I wanted to ask you about as well. We always talk about character development and storytelling. So in terms of the development of this character, like, how do you go about developing him? Was he just kind of like, he came to your, what made you create him the way that he was? And do you know, like, a lot about this character? Or was he kind of just a vessel to tell the story?
In this case, he was more just a vessel to tell a story. This character is just kind of emblematic of the emotion. So like I said, I tried to make his colors reflective of fall colors, or but not too obviously so, but enough that, like, you feel it. And I didn't want it to be me, so I didn't draw myself. But other than that, it's just, a character that's embodying a emotion, which when it comes to a comic that's this simple and just to the point, you're working with archetypes. It's just keeping it simple.
Mm-hmm. And Teresa, as far as your characters here, how much thought did you put into developing their specific look or their image?
I mean, they are supposed to be me and my mom, and so I tried my best to be that. Although, you know, again, with my limitations, you can see my face is always super simple, just kind of dots for eyes and a line for a mouth. But one thing I've learned is that having consistency for your characters is important, just for clarity, so that you know what's happening, like as you scan through the panels, and you know who's who. And so I'm trying to remain. I mean, this was easy because it all took place in the same night, but trying to keep your characters consistent so that you can tell who's who as you're moving through the story is a really key part of comics. You know, that's why Charlie Brown is always wearing the zigzag shirt, you know, that kind of thing.
Yeah, absolutely. If I might ask, because I'm always admire memoir cartoonists who are able to kind of get outside themselves and put it down on paper. Like I've tried to do a little bit of that myself, but I think it takes a lot of courage. And I think, like, how do you reconcile like what you're communicating with like your own personal, like, you know that this is you, but it is also a character in your story. I'm kind of curious as how you feel, but like, is it hard for you to be that honest? Is it like to look at yourself objectively?
I mean, it doesn't seem hard because it's the only thing I've ever done. I haven't really written fiction, and I feel like that must be even harder in a way, because you don't know what happened and you know who the people are. But I think the key to writing any sort of memoir is to not be afraid to get honest, and for the memoirist to kind of not set herself up as the hero of the story, because you know, that kind of makes for a bad story. And so to remain kind of honest and raw and vulnerable is the key.
How about writing when you draw like your mother or your husband, for example? Like, do you worry about how you portray them? Like,
I do. I mean, in my book, my husband kind of sort of comes off as the hero, and so I wasn't as worried about that. The book I'm currently trying to write is about my relationship with my parents, and that's a little bit harder because, you know, there are things that I wish they had done differently, you know, in my life. And but again, I think the key is, you know, not to set anyone up as a villain, you know, because no one's a villain, and, you know, a true villain in most people's lives, and to try to get empathy and understanding around every single character, whether they're real or not, is an important part of being a writer.
And I kind of have a follow-up with that as well. What made you decide, because this, as a standalone story, it would have worked just fine without pictures. So what made you decide that it would work best in a graphic format?
I'm not sure it would have worked better or worked okay without pictures. You know, I think there's a power to imagery that comes through, you know, even like the page we're looking at right now, that you can't get with words. If I had tried to describe this scene, I don't know if I would have been as successful, which is, you know, which is the thing that I love about comics, is that, you know, this sets the tone and the mood and tells you who we are and what's happening kind of so simply and elegantly. I don't think I could write that simply and elegantly and get the same feeling.
All right, so I'm gonna stop share here, and I want to change gears a little bit and revisit the quote that I used at the top of the show from Tom Spielman, where he said that comics make a statement. They always have, they always will. Brandon, I want to start with you. First off, do you agree with that?
No.
No. I like it.
I don't. I mean, I think if you talk about the larger sense of it has to make a political statement or it has to be, but I mean, it does usually begin with an idea. Mm-hmm. Sometimes it just ends up with an idea. It could go from a sketch into an idea, but there's a lot of different ways of doing it. And a lot of the time I don't have a concrete statement in mind, but I figure that out where I like something like it kind of is like an earworm. Like you get like an idea that means something, but you don't know until you figure it out. So a lot of time I'll start a comic and not have any statement in mind. Just like, will this be funny? Is it interesting? And then a lot of times there will be a statement in the end, and other times, hopefully it's just funny and interesting.
Teresa, what about you? Do you feel like they have to make a point?
I don't either. I agree with Brandon. I think the most interesting comics, at least, are the ones that are kind of open-ended and leave you with certain feelings and ideas, but don't necessarily like hit that nail on the head. Like, you know, I also recently just read a quote that I can't attribute because I have terrible memory about a poet who was saying, you know, the minute you know what a poem is going to be about, then you know you're going to be writing a bad poem, you know. And part of it is just in the exploration of getting stuff down and kind of opening up a world instead of, you know, closing it and putting it in a little box.
Yeah, no, I agree completely. When it comes to like, this is something that goes really well with like just single panel cartoons that you'll see like in the New Yorker. Like Roz Chast is really good at that. Like you'll look at a comic of her or a cartoon of hers, and I don't really know why it's funny, but it is. Like it does this thing. I don't know what it is. And there's a lot of my favorite cartoonists. I don't know why it's funny. Not that all comics have to be humor based or, but just using that as the most obvious example. Sometimes if it's a little more vague or confusing, it's hitting a part of your brain that neither the text alone or the image itself would do. Like it's this form and it means something that is just that.
Mm-hmm.
I think a lot of what comics does too is kind of makes the reader work at figuring out the meaning, you know, and what it means to themselves, you know. And so when it's too obvious, you know, with say a lot of political cartoons, you know, that are overtly political cartoons, it just doesn't sit well. It just, you know, you're telling me what to think, and that isn't really what I'm here for.
Mm-hmm. And there's also a big like that the marriage between text and drawing, or just even image and idea. It's what makes comics great. If it could work in another medium, then what's the point? So there's something magic when it happens when you see those two things come together. So it works just on its own level. I think we're getting a little bit away from the initial question.
Yeah.
That's okay.
In general, I do find that a comic is kind of its own beautiful thing that when those two things connect, it works on its own level. Mm-hmm. That doesn't necessarily have to be like, oh yeah, this is what they're trying to say, which they could just say in a tweet. Like, but it's a drawing, and it's, you know, that connection is what it is, and that's gets the emotions up. It gets the understanding through that.
So you brought up a point that I wanted to touch on now about one panel cartoons, where it's just the one thing, maybe just the one line of text, and yet it still more or less tells a complete story. You can glean a lot from it. So Brandon, how does your approach differ if you're telling something like a kid again, where it's multiple panels versus knowing that you're going to stick it just in one panel? Does that change your approach?
Kind of. I mean, obviously it's a different process, but it usually starts from the same place. My goal usually is when I have an idea initially, it's like, how small can I make this? because I don't want to spend a million hours working on a single comic. It's like, can I condense this? And oftentimes I can condense it to a single panel joke. But if it's a bigger idea, or if you need to communicate it larger, like the comic you showed of mine, I had to have him kind of thinking and raking, and then doing that process. And then you see him be a kid and enjoy that for the punch at the end. It really is just one joke, and it could have worked. In that sense, it's similar to a panel cartoon, but you need to take that ride to get there. So it's just how small can the idea be?
Teresa, what about you? Do you have experience trying to fit stuff into the smallest space you can? And how does that alter your approach?
No, I mean, I truly admire cartoonists who do the one panels, and I love New Yorker cartoons. And I haven't gotten there yet. I'm not able quite to distill things down to the real essence of everything. But the way I see it though is the difference between a one panel and a multi-panel cartoon is that the multi-panel usually kind of is time-based or requires some sort of sequence for it to work, and also requires a bit of pacing. So if you're telling a story that needs to unfold at a certain pace, then you need more than one panel.
Yeah, I mean, that's a big point. That's there is a rhythm to comics that kind of does differ from cartoons. Like there's a rhythm, it's its own distinct rhythm of like the picture and the wording has to work at a certain time in your brain. But it's true in comics, that sequence is important, and the rhythm, and it's just a good point. I'm just trying to digesting it while I'm speaking. But yeah, I agree. That does seem to be the biggest distinction.
So I want to talk about what it takes to publish comics and cartoons now. A quick reminder to our audience, if you have questions, get those in, and I'll get to them as soon as they come in. But I want to talk about publishing now. So Teresa, one of my favorite questions to ask writers, because I always get different answers, is how do you know when a piece is done? So I want to ask you, how do you know when a piece is done and ready to be sent off?
Well, two ways. One is you're just completely sick of working on it. That's for book length, I think, because you've worked by that point you've probably drawn the thing like 3 times or more, and you're just tired of it and you just want to move on. And the second thing is when you're able to show people, and so that doesn't necessarily mean on social media, but if you have trusted people whose standards are kind of the same as yours to show, that's probably how you know when it's done, at least done enough to show, and then you might do edits after that when you get feedback. But yeah, those are the two feelings that I get when I'm ready is I'm so sick of this, I don't ever want to look at it again. And then also, can I show someone without kind of cringing and hiding from it?
Brandon, what about you? How you've got this 2-week deadline that you're doing with the Rumpus, but how do you know when a piece is done?
Well, I mean, the deadline is important, but like Teresa said, being sick of it is a big thing when you draw it a million times. But the biggest thing for me, it's like I know where the initial idea began, and is that communicated? Am I babbling too much in the comic? Is it going on too long? Does the one panel kind of confuse the message? So I just kind of pare it down until I know that what that main idea I got across has gotten across, and I'm just generally happy with how it looks. So if what needs to be communicated is communicated, and I don't hate how it looks, then it's probably done.
So Brandon, your style, you'd been writing at the Rumpus for a while, and then you became the comics editor. So it's almost like they liked your style so much they wanted it to be their judge of style. How did that come about? How long had you been writing there?
Well, I think the biggest thing was just persistence. My first entry in the comics was my first year of university. I studied journalism, so we had a couple of school papers, and I just started submitting a weekly strip to the school paper, and I did that for about 3 years, and it was pretty consistently awful. But like I said, failing in public is kind of how you have to do it, especially when you're in a small university with a small community. But this was around 2011 to 2013, and in 2013 they lost 4 pages of their school paper, so they cut my strip. And looking for a new home, I found the Rumpus, just kept submitting things to them. It took a couple, submit every week, because that was my process. I worked, 1 comic a week. And because of that, they said, do you want to do a series? Then when I did that, I'm like, can I do illustrations? Can I do, I just jumped on every opportunity that I had. And so then I started to talk with the editors. The previous editor, Paul Madonna, was looking to move on. So after I began my series for about a year or so, we discussed about like what the content is. He showed me the process, what they tend to accept there, what the aesthetic of the site is. And we had those conversations, and after a few months, they just made me the full editor. I've been doing it ever since for the past 5 years or so. But I mean, those initial conversations were very helpful, because when you mentioned style, every website is different, and the Rumpus in particular has continued to change. I believe for the better. It's getting more specific, more women friendly, more political, and you always have to keep in mind what that is and move with it.
So that segues perfectly into what I was going to ask Teresa, which is, you've had a few pieces at the Believer as well. How do you know that a piece is right for a specific magazine, or do you just kind of send it and hope for the best, or do you write pieces specifically for a publication?
The Believer was actually my first periodical or kind of non-book publication that I had published, and I was lucky in that I had gotten into that Tin House workshop and worked with Kristen Radke in the workshop on that piece. And at the end of the workshop, she had asked, if you do revisit this and make changes, could you send it to us at the Believer? And so that was, a really great and wonderful thing that she did for me, was just invite me to do that. Because honestly, I don't know if I would have done that on my own. Because, again, I'm just, I look at the Believer, I look at the Rumpus, and I look at the caliber of art in those kind of publications and go, I'm not ready for, and so that was kind of a different kind of situation. Now I've been just reading a lot and going to different publications, websites, and trying to figure out what types of comics that they publish. I think, this is a tip that I give anyone who's trying to publish anywhere, is like, you need to read, you need to know the type of content that different editors are looking for, and kind of get a sense for what they find funny, or what they what kind of topics they like to cover. And so this is what's going to be published with Brandon in the Rumpus isn't going to be the same as what's going to be published in Catapult or or the Believer. And so I think right now I'm just trying to learn what all the different publications do, and get a feel for their sensibilities.
Mm-hmm. Brandon, go ahead.
I think that's a great point. Like, it has been said, several times before, that you should read what you do, and it seems basic, but a lot of people don't do that.
Yeah.
I get a lot of I'll get cartoons that are like Ben Garrison style pro-Trump gay cartoons. Like, you're obviously not reading the site. Like, one, we don't do gay cartoons, and two, we certainly don't do Trump. So or positive representations anyway. But this is kind of something that's becoming a bigger deal online because there's more sites, there's more opportunities, but they are more fragmented. You can't just be a cartoonist and then publish anywhere. Where traditional publishing kind of had more of that model where it was more of a monolith, but now everybody has their own niche favorite site. So that's kind of compounded when it comes to comics because they not only do you have to have similar sensibilities, but it's a general aesthetic that aligns with the look of the site and the feel of the site. So keeping an eye out for what you like and what you kind of aspire to and following that seems to be the biggest key. If you're drawing something that resembles something on the site before, but like doesn't have to be too closely, but you just generally have that sense of what a site is looking for. And the first thing I'll see is like, I'll look for in a submission is, does this look like somebody who cares about the site, cares about the same values that the Rumpus shares? Do they, is it drawing from an honest place? Is it experimental? We like to do a lot of memoir comics. So again, yeah, just to make the point again, is just every site's becoming more niche. So you really do need to look at what they're publishing.
Mm-hmm. So I want to slip one more question in here before we get to the audience questions. Brandon, when you're judging, when you're looking at submissions, are there any red flags that people can avoid? Like anything that for you see and you're like, we can't, I mean, you hit a few there, just knowing what you run, and you've mentioned clarity a few times, but is there anything else that writers and illustrators can avoid doing to heighten their chances?
Yeah, one thing to do to heighten your chance is to be specific in your submission intro. Like people say flutter gets you nowhere. That's not true. Compliment something on the site, show that you've read something or why you're interested in writing for the Rumpus, for example, like what brought you here. So make it a little bit more personal than just here's a sample of my work or please publish this. So be direct and kind of talk about what you've worked on in the past. Then when it comes to the work itself, clarity is number one. Really work on lettering. That's something that a lot of people struggle with, and I personally have struggled with in the past. I don't mind text or computer text in a comic, but it's got to be done really well. So making sure that I can read it. If it looks like a big mess, I'm probably just going to skip over it. And again, values are aligned with what we're publishing. And a big red flag I've seen a lot lately. We published a few poetry image collections, like a comic that uses both poetry and panels to kind of accentuate that. But increasing number of things that don't have any relationship, it seems, with the text and you have like a big brick of text and image. There's lots of different ways to do comics, but you need to make sure that there's some kind of relationship there. So clarity, a general understanding of your audience and the medium, and that you care about the site and that you actually do want to be published by us.
Mm-hmm. All right, so I'm going to get to our audience questions here. First one, Teresa, you already kind of talked about this a little bit in the very early goings, so I want to field this to you first. Have you considered outsourcing your drawings to work on writing, or vice versa? Have you considered outsourcing the writing to work on your drawings?
When I first came up with the idea of doing a graphic memoir, I thought I couldn't possibly draw it myself. And so I was going to try to find a collaborator to do the drawing, and which would have been great, I think, in one way. But again, it's such a personal story that my friend, who was an illustrator, turned me down and told me I had to do it myself. And I'm glad he did that. That was the best advice I'd ever gotten, I think. Because there is something, again, out of that comes out of your own hand, when you're drawing, and it's the same as what Brandon was saying when you're doing your lettering too, is that computer font will never be quite the same as your own hand, and that font won't always necessarily match your style of drawing, and your style of drawing might not necessarily match your style of writing if you've got someone else drawing it. And so it depends on the story, I think. There are lots of great collaborations between writers and comics artists out there. But if you're telling a really personal story, I think that it really does need to come from your own hand.
Yeah, I would agree for them. Like there are some great collaborations, but I think there is, even when that works, there's tends to be a connection between the illustrator and the author that the illustrator really understands what the author's trying to get across. But I think that the reader responds automatically. That they do like that connection between the art and the wording being from the same author. Comics is a lot more raw than almost any other form of storytelling, because it's coming from somebody's point of view, someone's hand, so they'll write it, they'll draw it, oftentimes. So people respond to that directness and that kind of rawness. I think that is oftentimes lost when you bring in an illustrator who's separate from the author.
Next question, Brandon, I'll start with you on this one. What elements of storytelling do you think are unique to comics that can't be found in any other mediums?
Well, I'm a huge fan of wordless comics. Like obviously we just showed one of mine. I think that, like I said, there is something more direct when it's written down by one single person, and there's an open honesty that I think lends itself well to memoir comics, especially, that you've seen that grow consistently, that people are not just getting the idea across in terms of the wording. There's a deeper connection because they see the imagery, they see kind of what's in your head. So I don't know if it's something that just can't be done elsewhere. It's just comics does it better. It does it cleaner, more direct, and there's a clarity of message that you just can't get through prose or poetry or any other format, or filmmaking, which I think it shares as much with filmmaking as it does with prose, but it still has its own unique slant.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, for me, I also like, when comics artists do things, kind of break out of that box and do like a big diagram in the middle of their book, or like things that you can't, absolutely can't do in prose, where kind of everything breaks loose and words and images are kind of everywhere, but it still all makes sense. It's just, you can read it in different directions or in different ways. And
absolutely. Chris Ware does this a lot, and I know in your book too. It just a different way to present the information that tends to be a lot more clear. Like pointing into the page we discussed, I mentioned earlier. You got a lot across, you got months across of your pregnancy on a single page, but it's clear, it's a graph, and it still works on an emotional level, but it's a clarity that you just couldn't get if you just try to describe the symptoms like as a list.
Mm-hmm. So we're just about out of time. I want to get one last question in here, which is just recommendations from you two, either cartoonists or graphic novels or cartoon series, or just recommendations for resources that aspiring cartoonists can look at to sort of get themselves started, get into this field of cartooning and comics. Let's start with you, Brandon.
Yeah, so I don't have any specific graphic novel artist selections, because I like being surprised by what people bring to it. Like I'm noticing increasingly, especially I'm going to generalize here, but from female cartoonists seem to have more of a variety of changing things. They're less bogged down by the past, because comics have been very exclusively, both in terms of authorship and marketing, directly towards men since the beginning. So since with the online world, you're seeing things open up more. I'm seeing people draw in influences from more books and paintings, and it's more exciting for me now to see people draw from things that aren't just old comics. But obviously follow what you like. There's a lot of great comics out there. And in terms of resources, try and be varied. Try looking for, you're probably not going to get to the New Yorker your first try. You're probably not going to get to a graphic novel right off the bat. So definitely try social media. Definitely look at some smaller gag sites that probably won't be paid, but you'll get some stuff out there. So Nearly Robots is good. Weekly Humorist is great. American Bystander is a Prince publication I've published with a couple times. So kind of use social media as the bedrock for getting your work collected in a single place, but then cast a wide net.
Teresa, what about you?
Yeah, I agree with Brandon. I'm very excited when I look at works by women and people of color, especially because there's some newness and freshness that of perspective that's coming through there. And so I follow new people on Instagram all the time, and one I really like is Bianca Eunice. That's XUNISE, and she's a syndicated cartoonist actually who works with Six Chicks and has a comic strip in papers, but she also has a Instagram site too. And I think for books and how to get started, one book that really helped me was Ivan Brunetti's book on cartooning. And it's filled with exercises that you can do just to build up your practice, and great tips, just like from simple things like try using some more black and see how that looks, and stuff like that. And so Ivan Brunetti, definitely, he actually has a book for little kids actually that my kids have looked at, and that book has enough tips that would help an adult too. And so either of his cartooning books are very useful.
All right. Well, we are out of time. We're actually a little over time, so I appreciate you both being flexible there. A quick reminder again: this is our last episode of the season, so Inside Writing is going on a break until March 10th. We'll be back with Inside Social Media. We're going to be talking about the writing life next season. So thank you all for being here. Teresa, Brandon, thank you so much for being here with us today.
Thanks for having me.
And everyone else, we will see you in March. Have a good rest of the winter, I guess. See you all then.